My name is Lien of the Silver Moon Pack, and this is the story of how rejection became the greatest gift of my life. At 20 years old, I was considered one of the most promising healers in our pack's history. My empathic abilities allowed me to sense not just physical wounds, but the deeper emotional traumas that often prevented true healing. I had always believed that my gift was meant to serve my destined mate, my fated bond that would complete my soul and give my life its ultimate purpose. The lunar bonding ceremony was the most sacred ritual of our pack, held only once every 3 years under the light of the blood moon. It was during this ceremony that fated mates would finally recognize each other, their souls calling across the sacred circle in a bond that transcended mortal understanding. I had waited for this moment since I first presented as an Omega at 16, knowing with absolute certainty that my mate would be someone worthy of the powerful healing magic that flowed through my veins. Ronan Blackstone stood at the center of the ceremony circle, his commanding presence drawing every eye in the assembled pack. As the heir apparent to our alpha leadership, he was everything an Omega was supposed to desire in a mate. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of natural authority that made others instinctively defer to his will. His dark hair caught the moonlight like liquid shadow, and his piercing blue eyes held the promise of strength and protection that every Omega dreamed of finding in their alpha. When our eyes met across the sacred flames, I felt the familiar pull of recognition that I had been anticipating for years. The bond between us was undeniable, a silver thread of connection that seemed to vibrate with the power of ancient magic. My heart raced as I stepped forward, following the call of destiny that had been written in the stars since the moment of my birth. This was it. This was the moment when my life would truly begin. But instead of the acceptance I expected, instead of the joy and recognition that should have filled Ronan's eyes, I saw something else entirely. Disgust, disappointment, a cold rejection that hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I will not bind myself to a low-level Omega whose only purpose is to heal scratches and bruises. Ronan's voice boomed across the ceremonial grounds, loud enough for every member of the pack to hear. My future lies with an alpha equal to my station, not with someone whose greatest achievement is growing herbs in a garden. The words struck me like lightning, each syllable more devastating than the last. Around us, the other pack members began to murmur among themselves, their voices creating a buzz of shock and disapproval that seemed to echo from the very stones beneath our feet. I could feel their eyes on me, their judgment pressing down like a weight I could barely bear. The bond may exist, Ronan continued, his voice never wavering, never showing even a hint of the uncertainty that should have accompanied such a momentous decision. But I choose to reject it. I choose to seek my destiny elsewhere, with someone who can stand beside me as an equal rather than trailing behind like a shadow. The formal rejection hit me like a tsunami of pain, starting in my chest and radiating outward until every nerve in my body felt like it was on fire. The silver thread that had connected us began to fray and snap, each broken strand sending waves of agony through my entire being. I watched in horror as Ronan reached up and physically grasped the mystical bond between us, his face showing no emotion whatsoever as he tore it apart with his bare hands. The broken pieces of our connection fell to the ground like dying stars, their light fading until nothing remained but empty darkness. I felt something fundamental inside me shatter, a piece of my soul that I knew would never be whole again. The rejection wasn't just emotional. It was spiritual, physical, a wound that cut deeper than any blade ever could. My father, Alpha veteran Marcus Silvermoon, stood among the assembled pack elders, his face a mask of shame and disappointment. When I looked to him for support, for some sign that he still considered me his son despite this public humiliation, he simply turned away. The man who had raised me, who had taught me the value of honor and duty, couldn't even meet my eyes. My mother, Luna Elena, stood beside him in silence. I watched her struggle with the decision, saw the way her hands trembled as she fought between her maternal instincts and her loyalty to her mate. In the end, loyalty won. She followed my father, leaving me alone in the center of the circle with the broken remnants of my future scattered at my feet. The pack council convened immediately following the ceremony, their voices hushed but their intentions clear. An Omega who had been rejected by his fated mate was considered unstable, potentially dangerous to the delicate balance of pack dynamics. There was no place for me in the Silver Moon Pack anymore. I was given until dawn to gather my belongings and leave the territory forever. That night, I packed what little I could carry in a single bag. My healing supplies, a few changes of clothes, and the silver pendant that had been my grandmother's, the only piece of family history I had left. As I prepared to leave the only home I had ever known, I could hear the celebration continuing in the distance. The ceremony had proceeded without me, other fated pairs finding their happiness while I faced exile and isolation. The journey away from pack territory was a blur of pain and exhaustion. Without the stabilizing influence of a pack bond, my Omega physiology began to suffer almost immediately. The chronic fatigue that comes with isolation set in first, followed by the persistent ache of loneliness that settled into my bones like a disease. I had grown up surrounded by the constant comfort of pack bonds, the subtle connections that made us stronger together than we ever could be apart. Now, for the first time in my life, I was truly alone. I found temporary shelter in a border town called Millhaven, a place where displaced Omegas sometimes gathered when they had nowhere else to go. It was a harsh environment, filled with others who had been cast out from their own packs for various reasons. Some had committed crimes, others had simply been deemed unfit for pack life. I was one of the few who had been rejected by a fated mate, a circumstance that made me an object of both pity and suspicion. The townspeople treated me with a mixture of condescension and outright hostility. Omegas without pack protection were considered fair game for any kind of mistreatment, and I learned quickly to keep my head down and avoid drawing attention to myself. I found work doing manual labor, cleaning stables and hauling supplies for merchants who were willing to pay substandard wages for desperate workers. At night, I would retreat to the tiny room I rented above a tavern, the walls so thin I could hear every conversation and argument from the other residents. The isolation was crushing, a constant reminder of everything I had lost. My empathic abilities, which had once been a source of strength and pride, now felt like a curse. I could sense the emotions of everyone around me, their anger and frustration and despair, but I could do nothing to help them or myself. The physical effects of pack separation grew worse with each passing day. My healing abilities began to fade without the stabilizing influence of a pack bond, leaving me feeling hollow and incomplete. I lost weight, my body struggling to maintain itself without the proper energetic support. Sleep became elusive, my dreams filled with images of the life I had lost and the future that would never be. It was during one of these dark nights, when the pain of isolation had become almost unbearable, that I made the decision that would change everything. I couldn't continue living in this half-existence, this shadow of what I had once been. If I was going to die, I would rather do it on my own terms, in a place of beauty rather than surrounded by the squalor and desperation of Millhaven. I set out for the Mountain Lake region, an area of wild beauty that had always called to me during my childhood. The legends spoke of ancient magic in those mountains, of powers older than the pack bonds that governed our society. If I was going to fade away, I wanted to do it somewhere that still held mystery and wonder. The journey took me 3 days of hard walking, my weakened body struggling with the rough terrain and bitter cold. By the time I reached the shores of the Great Lake, I was exhausted beyond measure, my strength completely depleted. The water was so clear I could see straight to the bottom, its surface reflecting the snow-capped peaks that surrounded it like a mirror. I collapsed beside a stream that fed into the lake, my body finally giving out after days of pushing beyond its limits. As consciousness faded, I remember thinking that at least I would die in a place of beauty, surrounded by the kind of natural power that had always spoken to my soul. The sound of running water became my lullaby as I surrendered to the darkness that had been calling to me for so long. When I woke, I was no longer by the stream. Instead, I found myself in a warm, comfortable bed, my body wrapped in soft blankets that smelled of cedar and mountain air. The room around me was unlike anything I had ever seen, with walls of polished stone and windows that looked out over the lake I had been trying to reach. Tapestries depicting dragons and other mythical creatures hung from the walls, their colors vibrant and alive in the morning light. A servant entered the room as I was trying to sit up, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and gentle hands who immediately began fussing over my condition. He brought me hot broth and fresh bread, his movements efficient but caring as he helped me regain some strength. When I asked where I was, he simply smiled and said that I was a guest of the master of the house, and that all would be explained in due time. It was later that evening when I finally met the man who had saved my life. Kale Dragonheart entered my room like a force of nature, his presence filling the space with an energy that made the air itself seem to vibrate. He was tall and lean, with the kind of elegant strength that spoke of centuries of refined power. His hair was dark as midnight, and his eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the wisdom of ages. But it was his scent that truly captured my attention. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a complex blend of fire and earth and something indefinably ancient that spoke to parts of my soul I hadn't even known existed. This was no ordinary man, no simple pack alpha or beta. This was something far older, far more powerful than anything I had ever imagined. "You were dying," he said simply, his voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "My servants found you by the stream, half frozen and completely depleted. You're lucky to be alive." I tried to thank him, to express my gratitude for his kindness, but he held up a hand to stop me. There was something in his eyes that made me pause, a calculating look that suggested this rescue had not been entirely altruistic. "You're an Omega," he continued, his gaze never leaving my face. "A healer, if I'm not mistaken. Your energy signature is quite unique, more refined than most of your kind. You've been rejected by your pack, cast out and left to fend for yourself." The accuracy of his assessment made me uncomfortable, but I nodded anyway. There was no point in trying to hide the truth from someone who could read it so easily in my weakened state. "I have a proposition for you," Kale said, settling into a chair beside my bed with the fluid grace of a predator. "You need a place to stay, protection from the elements and the various dangers that threaten lone Omegas. I have need of someone with your particular skills, someone who can manage the domestic aspects of my household while I attend to other matters." The offer was unexpected, but it wasn't entirely surprising. Many displaced Omegas found themselves in similar arrangements, trading their labor for basic protection and shelter. It wasn't ideal, but it was certainly better than the alternative of slowly dying in the wilderness. "What exactly would you expect from me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the weakness that still plagued my body. "Simple domestic tasks," he replied. "Cooking, cleaning, maintaining the household. You would have your own quarters, adequate food and clothing, and the protection of my name. In return, I would expect discretion, competence, and absolute loyalty." There was something in the way he said the word loyalty that made me pause, but I was in no position to negotiate. The alternative was to return to the desperate existence I had fled, or to simply lie down and wait for death to claim me. Neither option held any appeal. "I accept," I said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since he had entered the room. Something shifted in his expression then, a subtle change that I couldn't quite interpret. It might have been satisfaction, or perhaps just acknowledgement of a business transaction completed. He nodded once and stood to leave, but paused at the doorway. "One more thing," he said without turning around. "You should know that I am not entirely human. This household operates by different rules than those you might be accustomed to. As long as you remember your place and perform your duties satisfactorily, you will be treated with respect. But do not mistake kindness for weakness or hospitality for equality." With that, he left me alone to contemplate the strange turn my life had taken. I was no longer a member of a pack, no longer even truly a free individual. I had become something else entirely, a member of a household that existed outside the normal social structures I had grown up with. It should have been terrifying, but instead I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, I had a purpose, a place where I belonged, even if that belonging came with conditions and restrictions. The next morning, I began my new life as a member of Kale's household. The work was not particularly difficult, mainly consisting of preparing meals, maintaining the cleanliness of the common areas, and managing the various supplies needed to keep such a large residence functioning. The house itself was a marvel of architecture, with rooms that seemed to shift and change depending on the needs of the moment, and windows that sometimes looked out on the lake and sometimes revealed vistas of places I was certain couldn't exist in the physical world. Kale was a distant but not unkind master. He would appear for meals occasionally, always polite but never particularly engaging in conversation. He treated me with the kind of professional courtesy one might show a competent employee, acknowledging my presence without showing any particular interest in me as an individual. It was a far cry from the crushing indifference and hostility I had faced in Millhaven, but it was also a constant reminder of my reduced circumstances. Still, there were moments when I caught glimpses of something deeper in his character. Once, I discovered him in the library reading to a small dragon hatchling that had apparently been injured in some kind of territorial dispute. His voice as he read was gentle, almost tender, completely at odds with the distant authority he maintained in his interactions with me. When he noticed me watching from the doorway, he simply nodded and continued reading, as if caring for wounded creatures was simply another part of his daily routine. Another time, I found him in the garden, tending to a section of rare herbs with the same careful attention most people reserved for precious gems. His hands moved with practiced skill as he harvested leaves and flowers, his knowledge of their properties clearly extensive. When I offered to help, expecting to be dismissed, he instead spent the better part of an hour teaching me about the more exotic specimens, his usual reserve giving way to genuine enthusiasm for the subject. These glimpses of his true nature intrigued me more than I cared to admit. There was clearly more to Kale than the distant authority he projected, depths of character that he kept carefully hidden from casual observation. I found myself watching for these moments, treasuring them as small gifts that made my new existence more bearable. As the weeks passed, I began to find a rhythm in my new life. The work was satisfying in its own way, providing structure and purpose that had been missing during my time in exile. My healing abilities, while still diminished without pack support, were sufficient for the minor injuries and ailments that occasionally affected the household staff. More importantly, I was eating regularly and sleeping in a warm, safe bed, luxuries I had learned not to take for granted. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as I was preparing dinner in the kitchen, that I first encountered the child who would change everything. I heard crying coming from one of the unused rooms on the upper floor, a sound so heartbroken that my empathic nature compelled me to investigate despite my instructions to mind my own business. What I found was a small boy, perhaps 8 years old, huddled in the corner of an empty room with tears streaming down his face. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he had the kind of hollow look that spoke of recent trauma. But it was his scent that truly caught my attention. He was an Omega, a child Omega who had been separated from his pack under circumstances that were clearly traumatic. "Hey there," I said softly, crouching down to his level and using the same gentle tone I had once used with the children in my birth pack. "Are you hurt?" The boy looked up at me with eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. "Are you going to send me away too?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said firmly, moving closer despite his obvious fear. "I'm not going to send you anywhere. My name is Lien. What's yours?" "Elias," he replied after a moment of hesitation. "I don't have a pack anymore. They said I was too weak, that I would never be able to contribute anything useful. They left me at the edge of the territory and told me not to come back." The story was heartbreakingly familiar, a variation of the same rejection and abandonment that had led to my own exile. Looking at this child, seeing the same pain and confusion that I had felt in my own heart, I felt something awaken inside me that had been dormant since my rejection. The instinct to protect, to heal, to nurture, all the qualities that had once made me a valued member of my pack. "Well, Elias," I said, holding out my hand to him, "you're not alone anymore. Come on, let's get you cleaned up and get some food in you. We'll figure out the rest later." When Kale returned that evening, he found me in the kitchen with Elias, the boy clean and fed and wrapped in one of my spare blankets. I expected anger, or at least annoyance at my presumption in taking in a stray without permission. Instead, Kale simply studied the child for a long moment before nodding once. "He can stay," he said simply. But he's your responsibility. If you're going to take on the role of caretaker, you need to understand that it's a permanent commitment. Are you prepared for that? I looked down at Elias, who was watching our conversation with wide, hopeful eyes, and felt something settle into place inside my chest. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'm prepared. That night, as I helped Elias settle into the small room adjacent to my own quarters, I felt more like myself than I had since the night of my rejection. Caring for this child, protecting him from the same abandonment and loneliness that had nearly destroyed me, gave my life a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. I was no longer just a displaced Omega working for room and board. I was a guardian, a protector, someone who could make a real difference in the life of another person. The addition of Elias to our household created a subtle but significant shift in the dynamics of our daily life. Kale, who had maintained his distance from me during my first weeks in his service, began to take more interest in our small family unit. He would sometimes join us for meals, listening with apparent fascination as Elias told stories about his adventures in the forest or shared his observations about the various creatures that lived around the lake. More surprising still, Kale began to take an active role in Elias's education. The boy had received virtually no formal schooling during his short life, but he had a quick mind and an eager curiosity about the world around him. Kale would spend hours in the library with him, teaching him to read and write, sharing stories and legends that brought the child's imagination to life. Watching them together, I could see glimpses of the man Kale might have been in different circumstances, someone capable of great tenderness and care. As autumn deepened into winter, our little family found its rhythm. Elias would help me with the lighter household tasks, his presence making even the most mundane chores feel less like work and more like shared activities. In the evenings, we would gather in the library, where Kale would read aloud from ancient texts and epic poems, his rich voice bringing the stories to life in ways that captivated us both. It was during one of these evening sessions that I first began to understand the true nature of Kale's identity. He was reading from a tome about the great dragon wars of antiquity, his knowledge of the details far more extensive than any scholar should possess. When Elias asked how he knew so much about dragons, Kale paused for a long moment before answering. "Because I was there," he said simply, his eyes meeting mine over the boy's head. "I am older than I appear, older than the pack structures that govern your people. I have seen the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of entire species. I am what your people would call a dragon, though I prefer to take human form for the sake of convenience." The revelation should have been shocking, perhaps even frightening. Instead, it felt like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. It explained so much about Kale. His commanding presence, his vast knowledge, the way he seemed to exist slightly outside the normal flow of time and society. It also explained why he had been so willing to take in displaced individuals like Elias and myself. He understood what it meant to be different, to exist outside the normal categories that most people use to define themselves and others. "Are you going to eat us?" Elias asked with the kind of direct curiosity that only children possess. Kale's laughter was warm and genuine, the first time I had heard him express such unguarded joy. "No, little one, I am not going to eat you. I prefer my meals to be less conversational." As winter gave way to spring, our household continued to evolve. Kale became more open about his true nature, occasionally taking his dragon form to patrol the territory or to hunt in the deeper parts of the forest. These transformations were awe-inspiring, revealing him as a creature of incredible power and majesty. In his dragon form, he was massive, with scales that gleamed like polished obsidian and eyes that held the wisdom of ages. But it was in his human form that I found myself most drawn to him. As he became more comfortable with Elias and myself, he began to let down some of the careful guards he maintained around his emotions. I would catch him smiling at Elias's attempts to imitate his serious demeanor, or see the way his eyes softened when he watched me tending to the herbs in the garden. These moments of vulnerability were precious, small gifts that made my heart race in ways I hadn't experienced since before my rejection. The first time I realized I was falling in love with Kale was during a late spring evening when we were working together in the library. Elias had fallen asleep in his chair, exhausted from a day of exploration and learning. Kale had draped a blanket over the boy's shoulders with infinite care, his movements gentle and protective. When he turned back to me, I was struck by the expression on his face. Tenderness, contentment, and something deeper that made my breath catch in my throat. "You're good with him," I said softly, not trusting my voice to remain steady at normal volume. "He reminds me of myself at that age," Kale replied, settling back into his chair across from me. "Curious about everything, eager to learn, but carrying wounds that others can't see. You've been good for him, Lien. Good for both of us, actually." The use of my name, spoken with such warmth and sincerity, sent a flutter through my chest that I hadn't felt in over a year. For so long, I had been simply the Omega or the servant, defined by my function rather than my identity. Hearing Kale speak my name like it mattered, like I mattered, was a gift I hadn't realized I was starving for. "I care about him," I said, meaning it completely. "I care about this life we've built together, all three of us." Something shifted in Kale's expression then, a subtle change that nevertheless felt monumentally significant. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving my face. "And I care about you, Lien. More than I should, perhaps. More than is wise for someone in my position." The admission hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. I wanted to respond, to tell him that I felt the same way, but the words seemed caught in my throat. The memory of my rejection was still too fresh, the pain of having my feelings dismissed and discarded still too raw. Kale seemed to understand my hesitation. He didn't push for a response, didn't try to force a conversation I wasn't ready for. Instead, he simply smiled and returned to his reading, leaving me to process the implications of what he had said in my own time. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts and emotions I had been trying to suppress for months. The idea that Kale might have feelings for me was both thrilling and terrifying. After everything I had been through, after the crushing rejection and abandonment I had experienced, the thought of opening my heart again felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. But as the days passed, I found myself paying closer attention to the small gestures and subtle signs that revealed Kale's true feelings. The way he would find excuses to spend time in whatever room I was working in. The way his eyes would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he would bring me small gifts. A rare flower from the forest, a book of poetry he thought I might enjoy, a piece of jewelry that had caught his eye during one of his trips to the nearby town. These gestures were never accompanied by pressure or expectation. Kale seemed content to simply express his affection through actions, allowing me to set the pace for any deeper emotional connection. It was a kindness I hadn't expected, a respect for my autonomy that stood in stark contrast to the way I had been treated by my former pack. The turning point came during a particularly difficult night in early summer. Elias had been having nightmares about his abandonment, waking up in tears and calling for parents who would never come for him. I had spent hours trying to comfort him, using my empathic abilities to soothe his emotional pain and help him find peace. By the time I had gotten him settled back to sleep, I was emotionally drained and physically exhausted. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping to find some tea to help me relax, only to discover that Kale was already there. He had prepared a pot of chamomile tea and was sitting at the small table where Elias and I usually took our meals. Without a word, he poured me a cup and gestured for me to sit across from him. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm cup and drawing comfort from its heat. "He's been having more nightmares lately. I think being happy here makes him remember what he lost, which makes the pain worse before it gets better." "And what about you?" Kale asked. "You're helping him heal from his trauma, but who's helping you heal from yours?" The question caught me off guard, mainly because it was the first time anyone had acknowledged that I might still be carrying wounds from my own rejection. I had become so focused on caring for Elias and managing the household that I had almost forgotten I had my own healing to do. "I'm fine," I said automatically, the response ingrained from months of having to be strong for everyone else. Kale's expression made it clear that he wasn't buying my deflection. "Lien, you were rejected by your fated mate and cast out by your pack. That kind of trauma doesn't just disappear because you found a new purpose. It's okay to admit that you're still hurting. His words were like a key turning in a lock I hadn't even realized existed. All the pain and anger and grief I had been suppressing suddenly rose to the surface, overwhelming me with their intensity. Before I knew it, tears were streaming down my face, and I was sobbing like I hadn't since the night of my rejection. Kale was beside me in an instant, his arms wrapping around me with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone of his size and power. He didn't try to quiet my tears or tell me everything would be okay. He simply held me, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of my emotions. I thought I was worthless, I whispered against his chest, the words coming out in broken fragments between sobs. I thought there was something fundamentally wrong with me, something that made me unlovable. When Ronan rejected me, it felt like the universe was confirming every doubt I'd ever had about myself. "You are not worthless," Kale said firmly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "You are not broken or wrong or unlovable. You are precious, Lien. You are valuable exactly as you are, with all your gentleness and compassion and healing gifts." Ronan was a fool who threw away the greatest treasure he could have possessed. The words were like healing balm to wounds I had carried for so long that I had forgotten they existed. For the first time since my rejection, I felt truly seen, truly valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. In Kale's arms, I finally began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was worthy of love after all. When my tears finally subsided, I found myself still wrapped in Kale's embrace, neither of us seeming eager to break the connection. There was something different about the way he was holding me now, something that spoke of deeper feelings than mere comfort or friendship. "Lien," he said softly, his breath warm against my hair, "I need you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with your Omega status, or your healing abilities, or any other role you might fill. I care about you as an individual, as the remarkable man you are. If you're not ready for that, if you need more time to heal, I'll wait. But I needed you to know where I stand." I pulled back slightly to look at his face, seeing sincerity and vulnerability there that took my breath away. This ancient, powerful being was opening his heart to me, offering me the kind of love and acceptance I had never thought I would find. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely unexpected. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of being hurt again, of opening my heart only to have it broken. But I'm also scared of missing out on this, on what we could have together." "Then let's take it slowly," Kale said, his thumb brushing away the last of my tears. "We don't have to rush into anything. We can just be together, whatever that means for us, and see where it leads." That night marked the beginning of a new phase in our relationship. We didn't immediately become lovers or partners in the traditional sense, but we did become something more than master and servant, more than just two people sharing a household. We became companions, friends, two souls who had found something precious in each other that neither wanted to lose. The changes were subtle at first. Kale began joining Elias and me for meals more regularly, our conversations becoming more personal and intimate. He would find excuses to work alongside me in the garden or the library, our shoulders brushing as we reached for the same tool or book. Sometimes I would catch him watching me with an expression of such tenderness that it made my heart skip a beat. For my part, I found myself becoming more comfortable with my place in his life. I no longer felt like a servant or a charity case, but like a valued member of a family that we were building together. I began to voice my opinions more freely, to make suggestions about the household management, to participate in decisions that affected all of us. Kale not only welcomed this change but seemed to actively encourage it, as if he wanted me to claim my rightful place as his equal rather than his subordinate. It was during one of our evening conversations in the library that the subject of my former pack first came up. Elias had fallen asleep in his usual chair, and Kale and I were discussing the political situation in the surrounding territories. He mentioned that there had been increased activity from various pack alliances, some kind of coordinated effort that was making the other supernatural communities nervous. "Do you ever wonder what happened to your pack after you left?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on building my new life that I rarely allowed myself to think about my past. Sometimes, I admitted, but I try not to dwell on it. That part of my life is over. But you still feel the loss, Kale observed. The rejection didn't just cost you a mate. It cost you your entire community, your family, your sense of belonging. That's not something you just get over. He was right, of course. Despite the happiness I had found with Kale and Elias, there was still a part of me that ached for the connections I had lost. I missed the casual camaraderie of pack life, the sense of being part of something larger than myself. Most of all, I missed the relationship I had once had with my parents, the unconditional love and support that had been withdrawn the moment I became an inconvenience. I used to think about what I would say to them if I ever saw them again, I said quietly. I used to imagine scenarios where I would prove my worth, where they would realize they had made a mistake in casting me out. But now I'm not sure I want that anymore. Why not? Kale asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. I took a moment to consider the question, really examining my feelings for the first time in months. Because I'm not the same person I was when I left, I said finally. I've learned what real love and acceptance feel like. I've learned that family isn't just about blood relations or pack bonds. I've learned that I have value beyond what I can provide to others. I don't need their validation anymore. Kale smiled at that, an expression of pride and affection that warmed me from the inside out. That's what healing looks like, Lien. Not forgetting the past or pretending it didn't hurt, but growing beyond it to become someone stronger and more complete. As summer progressed, our relationship continued to deepen and evolve. We never formally declared ourselves as mates or partners, but we began to function as a unit in ways that felt natural and right. Kale would consult with me on decisions affecting the household, and I would offer my insights and opinions freely. We shared domestic responsibilities, with Kale taking on more of the cooking and cleaning while I focused on managing our finances and correspondence. Most importantly, we became true co-parents to Elias. The boy had blossomed under our combined care, his confidence and happiness growing daily. He had begun to develop his own healing abilities, though they manifested differently than mine. Where I could sense and manipulate emotions, Elias seemed to have an innate understanding of the physical body, able to identify injuries and illnesses with uncanny accuracy. Kale encouraged this development, working with Elias to understand and control his emerging powers. He would spend hours in the garden with the boy, teaching him about medicinal plants and their properties. It was during one of these sessions that I realized how completely our little family had integrated, how seamlessly we had become something more than the sum of our individual parts. The first real test of our new stability came in late summer, when messengers arrived at our door bearing news that would change everything. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I heard voices in the main hall, unfamiliar voices that carried the distinctive cadence of pack communication. My blood ran cold as I recognized the speech patterns, the formal phrasing that indicated official pack business. Kale appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression grim. "There are messengers from the Silver Moon Pack," he said without preamble. "They're requesting a meeting with you." The news hit me like a physical blow. After more than a year of silence, after I had finally begun to heal from the trauma of my rejection, my former pack was reaching out. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Something significant must have happened to prompt them to seek me out after all this time. "What do they want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "They wouldn't say," Kale replied. "Only that it's a matter of great importance to both our communities. They're requesting safe passage and a guarantee of neutrality during the meeting." I could feel my hands beginning to shake as the implications sank in. The Silver Moon Pack didn't make casual social calls, especially not to members they had exiled. If they were here, it meant they needed something from me, something important enough to overcome their pride and prejudice. "I don't have to meet with them," I said, more to myself than to Kale. "I don't owe them anything. They cast me out, they made their choice." "That's true," Kale agreed. "But running away from them won't change what happened. It won't give you closure or peace. Sometimes the only way to truly move forward is to face the past head-on." His words made sense, but that didn't make the prospect any less terrifying. The thought of facing Ronan again, of confronting the people who had rejected and abandoned me, filled me with a mixture of dread and anxiety that threatened to overwhelm my hard-won peace of mind. It was Elias who ultimately helped me make the decision. He found me in the garden that afternoon, sitting among the healing herbs I had been tending with such care. His young face was serious, but there was a strength in his eyes that reminded me of everything we had overcome together. "Are you going to talk to them?" he asked, settling down beside me on the ground. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to send them away, to tell them they lost the right to speak to me when they threw me out. But another part of me needs to know what they want, why they're here after all this time." "What does your heart tell you to do?" Elias asked with the kind of wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. I closed my eyes and tried to listen to my inner voice, to sense what felt right rather than what felt safe. "My heart tells me that I'm not the same person who left that pack," I said slowly. "I'm stronger now, more confident in my own worth. Maybe it's time to show them who I've become." That evening, I agreed to meet with the pack representatives. Kale insisted on being present for the meeting, both as the lord of the territory and as my chosen family. Elias, despite his youth, also requested to attend, wanting to stand with me as I faced this challenge from my past. The meeting was held in Kale's formal receiving room, a space designed to impress and intimidate visitors. The pack delegation consisted of 3 individuals. An elder I recognized as one of the spiritual leaders, a warrior who served as the pack's chief enforcer, and, to my shock and dismay, Ronan himself. Seeing my former fated mate again was like reopening a wound I had thought was healed. He looked older than I remembered, with lines of stress around his eyes and a tension in his posture that spoke of burdens he carried. When our eyes met across the room, I saw something I hadn't expected: regret, perhaps even pain. "Lien," the elder spoke first, his voice carrying the formal tones of official pack business. "We thank you for agreeing to meet with us. We know our presence here is unexpected." "Unexpected is one word for it," I replied, proud that my voice remained steady despite the turmoil inside me. "What do you want?" The elder glanced at Ronan, who seemed to be struggling with some internal conflict. Finally, Ronan stepped forward, his alpha bearing somewhat diminished but still present. "We need your help," he said simply, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. "The pack is in danger, and we believe you may be the only one who can save us." The irony was not lost on me. The pack that had cast me out as worthless was now asking for my help. The Omega they had deemed too weak to be worthy of their future alpha was suddenly essential to their survival. "What kind of danger?" Kale asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being answered. "There's been a plague," the warrior explained. "It started 3 months ago, affecting our healers first. They fall into a deep sleep and cannot be wakened. We've lost half our medical staff, and the condition is spreading to other pack members." "Why do you think I can help?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Because you're the only healer from our pack who wasn't affected," Ronan said. "You're the only one with the specific abilities needed to understand what's happening and potentially reverse it." The request was both flattering and insulting. They had dismissed my healing abilities as inadequate when I was a member of their pack, but now those same abilities were their last hope for survival. The situation would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. "Even if I could help," I said carefully, "why should I? You made it very clear that you had no use for me or my abilities. You cast me out, abandoned me to die in the wilderness. Why should I risk my life to save people who couldn't be bothered to save me?" Ronan flinched at my words, but he didn't deny their truth. "Because you're a better person than we are," he said quietly. "Because you have the kind of compassion and strength that we failed to recognize. Because even though we don't deserve your help, the innocent members of our pack don't deserve to suffer for our mistakes." The appeal to my sense of compassion was well calculated, but it was also genuine. I could sense the desperation in all 3 pack members, the fear and helplessness that had driven them to swallow their pride and come to me for aid. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "This isn't a decision I can make lightly." "Of course," the elder agreed. We understand the gravity of what we're asking. We'll remain in the area for 3 days, in case you decide to help us. After the pack delegation left, I found myself alone with Kale and Elias, all of us processing the unexpected turn of events. The kitchen, which had been our sanctuary of peace and normalcy, now felt charged with tension and possibility. "What are you thinking?" Kale asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm thinking that life has a cruel sense of irony," I replied. "I'm also thinking that I can't just ignore people who are suffering, even if they're people who hurt me." "You don't owe them anything," Elias said firmly. "They threw you away when you needed them most. You have the right to walk away." "I do have that right," I agreed. "But having the right to do something doesn't always mean it's the right thing to do. These people are dying, Elias. Children, elders, innocent pack members who had nothing to do with my rejection. Can I really let them suffer because of what their leaders did to me?" Kale was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Whatever you decide, you won't be going alone," he said finally. "If you choose to help them, Elias and I will come with you. We're a family now, and families stick together." The offer touched me deeply, but it also raised new concerns. "It could be dangerous," I pointed out. "We don't know what's causing this plague or how it spreads. I can't ask you to risk yourselves for my former pack." "You're not asking," Kale said with a smile. "I'm offering. Besides, I've been alive for over 1,000 years. I've seen plagues and curses and magical afflictions of every description. My experience might be useful. And I want to help too," Elias added. "I've been learning about healing from both of you. Maybe my abilities can contribute something important." Looking at these two people who had become my chosen family, I felt a surge of love and gratitude that nearly overwhelmed me. They were willing to risk everything to stand with me, to support me in a decision that could put us all in danger. It was the kind of loyalty and commitment I had never expected to find after my rejection. "All right," I said, my decision crystallizing in that moment. "We'll help them, but we do this as a family, and we do it on our terms. I'm not going back as a supplicant or a servant. I'm going as an equal, as someone who has something valuable to offer, but who doesn't need their approval or acceptance." The next morning, I sent word to the pack delegation that I would help them, but that I would be bringing my own team and working under my own authority. To their credit, they agreed to my conditions without argument. Desperation, it seemed, had a way of making people more flexible than they might otherwise be. The journey back to Silver Moon Pack territory was emotionally charged for me, but it was also revealing. Traveling with Kale and Elias, I could see the landscape of my childhood through new eyes. The places that had once seemed so important, so central to my identity, now appeared smaller and less significant. I had grown beyond the boundaries of my birth pack, had become someone who could exist independently of their approval or disapproval. When we reached the pack's main settlement, I was struck by how different it looked from my memories. The buildings seemed shabbier, the atmosphere more subdued. The vibrant community I remembered had been replaced by something fearful and diminished. The plague had clearly taken a toll on more than just the health of the pack members. My parents were waiting for us at the edge of the settlement, their faces a mixture of hope and shame. My father, once so proud and strong, looked aged beyond his years. My mother appeared to have been crying recently, her eyes red and swollen with grief. "Lien," my father said, his voice breaking slightly on my name. "Thank you for coming. I know we don't deserve your help, but—" "You're right," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "You don't deserve my help. But I'm not here for you. I'm here for the people who are suffering, the ones who had no say in what happened to me." My parents exchanged a look of pain and regret, but they didn't argue with my assessment. They knew they had failed me, had abandoned me when I needed them most. My presence here was a kindness they hadn't earned, and they were smart enough not to push for more than I was willing to give. The medical situation was even worse than the delegation had described. Nearly half the pack's healers were in various stages of the mysterious sleeping sickness, and several had already died from complications related to their condition. The remaining healers were exhausted and demoralized, having tried every traditional remedy without success. As I examined the affected individuals, I could sense that this was no ordinary illness. There was a magical component to their condition, a darkness that seemed to be feeding on their life force. My empathic abilities allowed me to perceive the emotional resonance of the curse, and what I found made my blood run cold. "This isn't a natural plague," I told Kale and Elias as we conferred in the temporary quarters we had been assigned. "It's a targeted curse, designed specifically to affect healers. Someone wanted to cripple the pack's ability to care for its members." "Who would do such a thing?" Elias asked, his young face troubled by the implications. "Someone with a grudge against the pack," Kale replied grimly. "Someone who wanted to see them suffer slowly, to watch their community crumble from within." As I delved deeper into the nature of the curse, I began to uncover its origins. The spell had been cast by someone with intimate knowledge of the pack's structure and vulnerabilities, someone who had access to personal items from the affected healers. This wasn't the work of a random enemy, it was an act of betrayal from within. The revelation came during my third day of investigation, when I discovered traces of the curse magic in an unexpected place. The spell had been anchored to a sacred artifact that was kept in the pack's ceremonial chamber, a place that only the most trusted members of the community could access. "We need to speak to the pack leadership," I told Kale and Elias. "This curse was cast by someone with inside knowledge and access. We're looking for a traitor." The emergency pack meeting was tense and fraught with accusations. As I presented my findings, I could see the fear and suspicion in the eyes of the assembled leaders. The idea that one of their own had betrayed them to this extent was almost too horrible to contemplate. It was during this meeting that the truth finally came to light. As I described the specific nature of the curse and the level of access required to cast it, I saw recognition dawn in the eyes of several pack members. They began to exchange meaningful looks, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. "There's only one person who has that kind of access and knowledge," my father said slowly, his voice heavy with realization. "Only one person who has been acting strangely since the plague began." The traitor turned out to be someone I had known since childhood, a healer who had always been jealous of my abilities and resentful of the attention I received from the pack leadership. When my rejection and exile had created an opening in the pack's hierarchy, he had seen it as an opportunity to advance his own position. But when that advancement didn't come as quickly as he had hoped, he had decided to eliminate his competition in a more permanent way. Confronting him was both satisfying and heartbreaking. To see someone I had once considered a friend and colleague reduced to such petty jealousy and malice was a reminder of how toxic the pack's competitive atmosphere had become. His actions had not only endangered the lives of innocent people, but had also revealed the deeper problems within the pack's culture. "You destroyed everything," I told him as the pack guards prepared to take him into custody. "You let your envy and resentment poison you to the point where you were willing to murder your own packmates. Was it worth it?" His response was a mixture of defiance and self-pity that I found deeply familiar. It was the same attitude I had seen in Ronan and other pack members, the belief that their personal desires and ambitions justified any action, no matter how harmful to others. Breaking the curse required a complex ritual that combined my empathic healing abilities with Kale's ancient magical knowledge and Elias's emerging powers. The three of us worked together for hours, carefully unraveling the dark magic that had been slowly killing the pack's healers. It was exhausting work, requiring precise coordination and absolute trust in each other's abilities. When the ritual was finally complete, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The cursed healers began to wake from their magical sleep, their life force returning as the dark magic was cleansed from their systems. The relief and joy of the pack members was palpable, a wave of emotion that I could feel through my empathic abilities. But the successful healing brought with it an unexpected consequence. As the pack members celebrated their recovery, they began to look at me with a new understanding of my abilities and worth. The same people who had dismissed me as a low-level Omega were now seeing me as their savior, the one who had risked everything to save them. The change in their attitude was both gratifying and troubling. I appreciated the recognition of my abilities, but I was also aware that their newfound respect was based on what I had done for them rather than who I was as a person. It was a conditional acceptance that felt uncomfortably familiar. It was Ronan who finally addressed the elephant in the room. On our last night in the pack territory, he approached me as I was packing our belongings, his expression serious and troubled. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Not just for rejecting you, but for the way I rejected you. I humiliated you publicly, dismissed your worth in front of the entire pack, and then allowed them to cast you out like garbage. There's no excuse for what I did." I looked at him for a long moment, taking in the changes that the past year had wrought. He was still handsome, still possessed of the natural authority that had made him an attractive mate, but he seemed diminished somehow, as if the weight of his choices had taken a toll on his spirit. "Why?" I asked simply. "Why did you do it? We were fated mates, Ronan. You felt the bond just as strongly as I did. Why did you choose to destroy it?" He was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the ground between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret and self-recrimination. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of what people would think. Afraid of appearing weak. Afraid of being vulnerable. I had this image of what an alpha should be, what kind of mate would make me look strong and successful. You didn't fit that image, and I was too much of a coward to challenge it." "And now?" I asked, curious despite myself. "Now I realize that I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me," he said, finally meeting my eyes. "I see what you've become, how you've grown and flourished without us, and I understand what I lost. You're stronger than I am, Lien. You always were. I was just too stupid and prideful to see it." The admission was both painful and liberating. For so long, I had wondered if there was something fundamentally wrong with me, some deficiency that had made me unworthy of love. Hearing Ronan acknowledge that the problem had been his own fear and prejudice rather than my inadequacy was a gift I hadn't known I needed. "I forgive you," I said, and meant it, not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger and resentment has been poisoning my own happiness. "I forgive you, Ronan, but I want you to understand that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending that what happened didn't matter." "I know," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to come back or to give me another chance. I just needed you to know that I realize what I did was wrong and that I'm sorry for the pain I caused." I nodded, feeling a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. This conversation wouldn't change the past, wouldn't undo the rejection and exile I had suffered, but it would allow me to move forward without the weight of unanswered questions. "I hope you learn from this," I said. "I hope you become the kind of leader and mate that your pack deserves, someone who values people for who they are rather than how they make you look." The next morning, as we prepared to leave the pack territory, my parents approached me one final time. My father looked older than his years, the guilt and regret of the past year evident in every line of his face. My mother seemed fragile, as if the weight of her choices had finally broken something essential inside her. "Son," my father began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know we don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness. We failed you when you needed us most. We chose loyalty to the pack over love for our child, and we've regretted it every day since. We know we can't undo what we did," my mother added, tears streaming down her face. "But we want you to know that we're proud of who you've become. We're proud of your strength, your compassion, your willingness to help people who didn't deserve your kindness." Looking at them, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. The love I had once felt for them was still there, buried under layers of hurt and disappointment, but it was tempered by the understanding that they had made their choice and would have to live with the consequences. "I understand why you did what you did," I said finally. "I don't agree with it, and I don't think it was right, but I understand it. The pack's approval meant more to you than your son's happiness, and that's something you'll have to live with." "We're sorry," my father said, his voice breaking. "We're so sorry, Lien." "I know you are," I replied, "and I hope that someday you'll find a way to forgive yourselves. But I need you to understand that I'm not coming back. I have a family now, people who love me unconditionally and support me completely. I wish you well, but my life is elsewhere." The conversation was painful but necessary. a final severing of the bonds that had once tied me to this place and these people. As we walked away from the pack territory, I felt a sense of freedom and completion that I had never experienced before. I was no longer defined by my rejection, no longer limited by their narrow understanding of my worth. The journey home was peaceful and reflective. Kale, Elias, and I spent the time processing what we had experienced and what it meant for our future. The crisis had tested our bonds as a family and had proven that we were stronger together than any of us could be alone. "I'm proud of you," Kale told me as we walked along the path that led back to our lake. "You faced your past with courage and grace. You helped people who had hurt you, and you did it without compromising your own integrity or self-worth." "I'm proud of all of us," I replied, looking at the two people who had become my anchor and my home. "We faced this challenge together, and we came through it stronger than before." "What happens now?" Elias asked, his young face serious but hopeful. "Now we go home," I said, the word carrying more meaning than it ever had before. "We go home to our life, our family, our future. We go home to the place where we belong." That evening, as we sat on the balcony of our house overlooking the lake, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. A year ago, I had been a broken, rejected Omega with no hope and no future. Now I was part of a family that had been built on choice rather than obligation, love rather than duty. "Do you ever regret it?" Kale asked, his arm wrapped around my shoulders as we watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if Ronan hadn't rejected you?" I considered the question seriously, thinking about the path my life might have taken if I had never been cast out from my pack. "I think about it sometimes," I admitted, "but I don't regret it. If Ronan hadn't rejected me, I never would have found you and Elias. I never would have discovered my own strength, my own worth. I never would have learned what real love feels like." "And what does real love feel like?" Kale asked, his voice soft with affection. "Like this," I said, gesturing to our small family, our home, our life together. "Like choosing each other every day, like supporting each other through challenges, like building something beautiful together, like being accepted completely for who you are, not who someone else wants you to be." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt a sense of peace and contentment that I had never thought possible. The rejection that had once seemed like the end of the world had actually been the beginning of something far more beautiful and meaningful than I could have imagined. "I love you," I said to Kale, the words carrying the weight of everything we had been through together. "I love you, and I love our life, and I love the family we've built." "I love you too," he replied, his voice warm with emotion. "I love you exactly as you are, and I'll keep loving you for as long as you'll have me." "Forever," I said without hesitation. "I choose you forever." And as we sat there under the stars, with Elias sleeping peacefully in his room and our future stretching out before us like an endless possibility, I knew that I had finally found my place in the world, not as someone's rejected mate or cast-out son, but as a complete person in my own right, worthy of love and capable of creating something beautiful with the people who truly mattered. The rejection that had once broken my heart had ultimately led me to the greatest love of my life. And for that, I would be grateful forever.